Yo, what's up, Mike? How you doing?
Good, man. How are you?
I'm ready for this big show, man. This is a very legendary band and a lot of fucking hits, a lot of fucking albums, and they
Oh yeah.
still going to today.
Well, yeah, pretty much. The music is still heard. That we're talking about Paul Revere and the Raiders. Yeah, we've been talking about doing this band for a while. To me, they're one of the most kind of underrated '60s garage bands. They had a lot of hits, but they're kind of lost in the shuffle with a lot. But when you start listening to the albums, it's just
Oh, they're
amazing.
great.
Some of the shit that they were doing, they were like ahead of their time.
Oh, they were definitely ahead of the time. Like that's stuff that you can bring out today, and it might still be a hit because the music was, it was great dance music. It was like they were pretty much first they started as an instrumental band.
A little bit, yeah.
And then they started putting lyrics, and it was fucking crazy. Once they started putting lyrics, it's like motherfucker, these guys are great, man.
Well, I mean, they started in the late '50s. Okay,
Yeah, I
that
was looking at that.
yeah, they were around. They definitely earned their bones touring. Okay, they worked hard in the beginning, and they had a lot of hits in the between like '65 and '67. They were as big as anybody, man. They were huge.
You wanna hit something? I don't think they're in the Music Hall of Fame,
No,
but
they're not.
they are in the Oregon Music Hall of Fame.
Right, because they were, and I think that's kind of forgotten sometimes. They were a Pacific Northwest based band.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, and that meant something back in the day. The Pacific Northwest was like a hotbed of like really good bands, like a band called the Whalers, a band
Oh
called
yeah,
Sonics. Okay, a bunch of other bands really came out of that area. They had a mix of like rock and roll and R&B. Okay, the Kingsmen came out of there too, the
yeah, the
original Louie
Kingsmen.
Louie.
Yeah,
So the Pacific Northwest is always an area that interests me when you talk about '60s garage music. Paul Revere was like right in the middle of that.
yep.
You
So,
know,
Mike, this is the Rock Show episode 67, and I think this is going to be a good show because there's a lot of history, a lot of fucking music, and like at the end of the day, they put out 28 albums.
yep, yep, 28 albums and plenty of top 10, top 20
Oh
singles.
my god, yeah. So, hit me up. Where are we going to start?
All right, well, the band was really like the brainchild of a guy named Paul Revere Dick.
Pour me a
Okay,
dick. Yep.
right? That was his real name. And he was born January 7th, 1938, in Harvard, Nebraska. He played piano. He also played organ.
Yep.
And his style, growing up, his style was similar to Jerry Lee Lewis. He would bang the keyboards just like the killer, Jerry Lee Lewis. And that's how he played. But growing up on a farm near Boise, Idaho, okay,
Boise, Idaho. Let me
he,
ask you:
he
did he have Native American blood?
I don't believe so, not that I know of. Why are you thinking that? Because of the Indian Reservation song?
Yeah, because that song go into some deep shit, man. Like that song
Well,
is
they
really
didn't they didn't even write that song. We'll get into that later.
right.
But I don't believe there was any, Native American blood going on in the band. That was a big comeback hit for them. But this is
Yeah.
early on in Boise, Idaho. Okay. Uh, Paul Revere Dick was an owner of a barber shop, and he had a drive-in restaurant.
Dude,
And that was
what the fucking chances that the fucking guy started as he was pretty
yeah,
successful without the music.
yeah, he was. He ran these two businesses in Caldwell, Idaho. And
Yep.
one day, 1958, he runs into a teenager a couple years younger than him named Mark Lindsay. And he was actually in a store picking up hamburger buns for his restaurant. And the two of them became fast friends. They had an interest in music and they wanted to start a band. So originally, the band that they started was a band called the Downbeats.
Yep.
Okay. But they wore Revolutionary War outfits, okay, like Paul Revere and the Rays would be known for.
Yeah.
They started doing that as the Downbeats. Um, and people, people liked it. They liked the whole get up. Eventually, Paul Revere would drop the last name Dick and just use Paul Revere. And in 1960, they decided to change their name to Paul Revere and the Raiders. They released a single that year on Gardenia Records called "Like Long Hair," and
Yeah, shit.
it was an instrumental.
Yeah.
Okay, like you were saying, they did a lot of instrumentals. They did a lot of covers in those days, as most bands did. Okay, um, the song was popular enough to get to number 38 nationally,
Yeah.
and in April, that would be in April of '61. The song was an even bigger hit regionally in the Pacific Northwest, and that's where singer Mark Lindsay was originally from. Okay, he was from Oregon,
Yeah.
and the band had kind of a revolving door of musicians in the beginning. They went through a lot of people their whole career, but in the beginning they didn't have a real solid band.
Yeah, guys would last like a year or less or 2 years, but they
Sometimes.
weren't even lasting that long. Um, when did Paul move to Oregon? Because I think they winded up leaving
Yeah,
Idaho and moving to Oregon, right?
I was gonna get into that now. He actually got drafted.
Yeah.
Okay. And there was still a draft in '61, but he signed up as a conscientious objector.
Okay.
And instead of putting him in an actual, I mean, we weren't at war in '61, but they didn't bring him anywhere where there could be a war.
Yeah.
They let him work as a cook in a mental institution.
Yep.
All right. Now his service at the time was considered deferred, so for a year and a half he did that. And during that same period, Mark Lindsay kept the band going, and because they had that top 40 single, so he kept the band going. And briefly, they brought in Leon Russell as a piano player.
That's amazing.
Okay? Yeah, and he went on to bigger and better things, but he was still, somewhat known at that time.
Yeah.
And he took Paul Revere's place on organ and piano, and Lindsay, to supplement himself between gigs, he was pumping gas in Oregon. All right. So the summer of '62, Revere was done with his military service, and he relocated back to Oregon to be with Lindsay. Okay. It was at that point that they really got like a band together that would stick for a while. They had a drummer named Mike Smitty Smith.
Yep.
And he would be with them for some time. They also met a DJ named Roger Hart.
He's kind of an extra character, man.
Roger Hart?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he was a popular DJ in the Portland area, I believe, and what he used to do was set up teen dances.
Yeah,
and he was looking for like a regular band. That was a big thing at the time,
Yeah,
and kids would all go to these dances and they'd check out these bands, and he needed kind of a regular band that would be on time and could bring in a crowd. And he had a conversation with somebody, and they mentioned to him, why don't you try this band called Paul Revere and the Raiders?
Yeah, it was a bank teller, actually.
You're right. I think it was a bank teller he was talking to. And he got the phone number, and he called up Paul Revere, and they talked on the phone. They agreed to meet for lunch. And right away, they hit it off, and he would sign them for a couple of teen dances. He also became the group's manager.
Yeah.
He liked them enough that he wanted to, help them out. So,
Mike, you know what I find shocking? These guys only got one record label. They were with Columbia all the time.
Yeah, they never, right.
Is that rare? Has that happened before? Because I know a lot of even like a guy like Michael, he went from label to label, but
it's not common anymore. It might have been a little more common back then, but even then, you generally would. I mean, even Elvis skipped labels.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So
yeah. So it's not that common, but you're right. Columbia would be interested in them. They weren't with them yet.
Yeah.
But they would record Louie Louie.
Yep.
All right. And what's interesting, Hart had brought them the song. They said they would do it. And they had decided to do it in a way that they wanted to sound like as black as possible. Okay. And their version of it's pretty, it's pretty R&B. It's good.
So who sang the first version of Louie Louie?
Nobody knows, man. Because
was it the Kingsmen, or was it them,
nope.
or was it some black dude?
Well, Louie Louie was originally a Jamaican song.
Yeah.
Okay, it was almost like a reggae, not reggae, but early kind of ska song.
Yeah.
Okay, and the lyrics are actually, if you listen to the original, the lyrics are pretty. You can understand them. The thing with Louie Louie, it was always a song that no one knew what the fuck anybody was saying, except for like a few lines. Okay, but there are some versions of Louie Louie you can understand a little bit better. You know who has a good version of Louie Louie? Fucking Motorhead.
Yeah.
Okay,
They got a
got a good
great
version of
version.
it. Yeah, but Hart brought them the song and said, let's do it, and they recorded it for the Sanday label. Okay, and that would attract the attention of Columbia. Now, at the same studio, at the same time, in the same month, okay, in April, I believe it was in
Yeah,
April
the
of
Kingsman.
'63. Okay, the Kingsmen went into that studio and recorded Louie Louie also. So nobody knows exactly what day it was recorded and who did it first, but they did record it in the same month in the same studio. All right. Now, the band lineup at that time was Revere on organ,
Mm-hmm.
Mark Lindsay singing, Mike Smith, Smitty Smith on drums, and a guy named Mike Doc Holliday
Yeah.
on bass, and a guitarist named Drake Levin. Now, the Raiders toured heavily through 1964. They were becoming very influenced by the British bands like the Beatles, the Stones, the Kinks. All those bands kind of were riding the American charts at that time. They wanted to be like them.
Yep.
Okay, they were enjoying what the British bands were doing. Remember, the British bands were taking American R&B and kind of spitting it back at
And
us.
it's funny,
Okay?
who was trying to start that also, T-Rex, when you think about it.
Yeah. When we talked about T-Rex last week, it definitely. I mean, it definitely they were doing that. That was maybe 10 years later, but yeah, okay.
But I mean, he
Um,
was already, like you were telling me, he was innovative. He was ahead of his time too, the guy, Mark Bolan.
absolutely was. Now, in early '65, they became acquainted with producer Terry Melcher. Melcher would eventually be involved with producing the Byrds, like Turn, Turn, Turn,
Yeah.
and stuff like that. Okay, but he brought the Raiders down to Southern California, and he also was very influenced by what the Stones were doing, the Beatles, the Dave Clark Five, even the Animals
Yeah.
were a band that was very influential, and they wanted to capture that kind of sound while adding some American R&B to it. So they started working on some songs, and their first major hit that they released was a single called "Just Like Me."
Fucking great song.
Great fucking song. Total. I mean, to me, that just kicked off the whole '60s garage rock
Yeah.
movement. That song,
Can I tell you a
Um,
funny story? One of the most picked album in international is the Paul Revere album.
yeah, I know. I've noticed that. I've sat there many times listening to Paul
Yeah.
Revere, but a lot of people do play it.
Yep.
Yeah, it's true. That is true. They got that one. I think it's a greatest hits
Yep.
in there, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Like I said, Just Like Me would be a big hit. Now, if you listen to that song, it's a very distinctive guitar sound. It's like a double track sound that Drake Levin made.
Yeah.
And very distinctive. There's very few songs that have that kind of sound. But the band was making regular appearances on TV.
Why did they call that double track guitar solo? What do they mean by that?
You take, okay, let's say you're recording now. When you record, things are done on tracks. You might have a drum track.
Yeah.
You might have a guitar track. What you do is you take a guitar track, you play it the way you want to play it,
Yeah.
and then you record another guitar track and you put it over it.
Oh shit! All right.
All right, so it's kind of like you're playing both parts, but they're at the same time, which you couldn't do physically, right?
Yeah, that's insane.
So, yeah. No, and in those days, in the mid '60s, early '60s, this was all new.
Yeah.
This kind of thing was like tricks that these producers came up with on their own. Now, some stuff was known from the 50s and earlier with like big band music. There was ways to make a bigger sound. They knew about overdubbing and all that. But with, rock and roll was only maybe 10 years old at that point. And it was, when you started getting into making things a little bit more produced, it was all new to them.
Okay.
So when you're doing these overdubs, it was a very distinctive sound for the time. Even now, when you hear it, when I first hear the first couple of chords of Just Like Me, you know what the song is.
Oh yeah, right away.
Yeah. Now, what the band was doing at that time that also helped promote them is they were making regular appearances on television. Shows like Where the Action Is, which was a Dick Clark show.
Yeah.
Okay. There was a show called It's Happening, and they actually co-hosted that, Mark Lindsay and Paul Revere. And so they would play on the show, and they would host the show as well.
How
They
about
even
how about the
the
appearance in Batman?
I was just gonna say there was an appearance in November '66 where they played themselves on an episode of Batman called His Honor the Penguin, and I do remember
I
that.
remember
I,
that
I,
too.
I remember them in their Revolutionary War outfits. You know,
Is that what
what
Batman did, like the Bat dance,
the
the
Batusi?
Batusi or whatever?
No, I don't think that was the one, but that's another famous one that's classic. You know, I, yeah, I love that one. Uh, Now, bass player Doc Holliday was replaced by a guy named Phil Volk in late '65.
Okay.
Volk had an endorsement, okay, with the Vox Amplifier Company.
Yeah, what was the
Uh,
deal with that? I was reading that. I
yeah,
never even knew
that
that.
Vox amps are some of the best amps you can get. Okay, even today. All right, there's a lot of bands in the '60s were using Vox because they had like they also made like the fuzzy wah wah pedal. They made like a lot of stuff that was like very distinctive to '60s music at the time. They gave them an endorsement, and the bass player Volk was using something called a Vox Phantom 4 bass amp.
Yeah, did they give him that stuff for free? Did they get the instrument
Yeah,
just because they were so
no,
that's
not the
big.
instrument, not the instrument, the amp.
The amps, okay. Yeah, that's what I mean. Did
Yeah,
they give him the amp for free? Because that's like huge. That's a
yes,
huge saving.
yeah. I mean, right, and that helped them. Okay, they didn't have to spend money on amps. Amps are expensive.
Yeah,
So Revere himself also used what was called a Vox Continental combo organ. Okay,
yeah.
so in that sense, I believe he might have had the actual instrument. Okay, because an organ is a little different. I don't think you really plug it in, but I'm not sure. I think you don't plug it into an amp, but I'm not positive. Um, Also, what they were known for is they were the first band reported to be that would plug in, and the whole band was actually amped up.
Yeah, and a
Okay.
Vaughn's like super Beetle amplifier.
Yeah, right. The Vox Super Beetle amp. The whole band was hooked up to it. And what they used to do too is they would have like because some of their songs had horns in it.
Yeah.
Okay, so they would have like maybe three guys
Okay.
playing horns, and they would be amped up, which was unheard of at the
You
time.
know how that sounded? That was like
Had to be fucking loud. Had to be fucking loud.
you think Motorhead got that thing from them to make as loud as possible? Remember?
Well, Motorhead was influenced by a lot of people, but yeah, I mean, Paul Revere. I'm sure he was. Lemmy was listening to that stuff because he was doing garage rock at the
Yeah,
time with
he
the Rockin'
was.
Pickers and stuff like that. So I'm sure he was checking that out. Paul Revere and the Raiders, if you think about it, I mean, they had to be loud,
Yeah.
definitely. So, and not too many bands. That was the beginning of days when people were amped up. When you watch old clips of the Beatles, they're playing like little tiny amps. No wonder nobody could hear them
Yeah.
screaming over them and all that. Now, what would happen is they would start having some lineup changes. Drake Levin would leave in '66.
Yeah, he
And he
joined
would
the
join.
National Guard.
Yeah, he joined the National Guard. A lot of people did that in '66. They didn't want to go to Vietnam. Okay, so if you join the Guard, you might not go.
Wow.
Okay, it was one way of getting out of it. He was replaced by a guy named Jim Valley, who was another like Pacific Northwest musician that they knew from earlier days. He had a nickname. They used to call him Harpo because he looked kind of like Harpo Marx. Right? Now, during the period of '66 to '67, they had several top 20 hits. The first being "Kicks," which made it to number
That's
4.
a fantastic song. That song got a lot of innuendos too.
Oh yeah, well, it's an anti-drug song technically.
Yeah.
Listen to it. There was a song called "Hungry" that got to number 6. Those two songs, "Kicks" and "Hungry," are just quintessential Raiders songs. They had a song called "The Great Airplane Strike" that would get to number 20. A song called "Good Thing" that would get to number 4.
Good Thing was in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yes, he used several songs in that movie.
It was great.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And then there was a song called "Him or Me, What's It Gonna Be?"
Great song.
Went to number 5. That's a great tune. Albums around this time, there was an album called "Just Like Us" in '66, and it had songs like "Stepping Out," "Just Like Me." They did a version of the Stones' "Satisfaction," a song called "Out of Sight," which was fantastic. 66, they also released Midnight Ride, which is probably my favorite album from them. An album called Spirit of 67, an album called Revolution that also came out in 67. Albums were going gold at that time, and they were actually Columbia Records' #1 rock band at that point.
Wow.
Okay. And that's saying a lot. And that definitely goes into what you were saying about why they were on that label for so long. It made them a lot of money. You know, in early 67, at the height of their popularity, Valli, Volk, and Smith would leave the band. Now, they left because their songs that they came to Revere and Lindsay they weren't interested in them. They wanted to have some writing involvement.
Some credits,
credits and stuff, and they weren't getting it. They also felt that the changing rock scene, that they were kind of too like teeny bopper. Okay. I don't know if they wanted to ditch the outfits, maybe they did, but they felt that, being on these like teeny bopper shows and stuff, when you had this kind of emerging serious rock and roll scene with bands, things like Hendrix and stuff like that were coming up. They felt maybe they weren't taking that seriously. So what would happen is Drake Levin would rejoin them briefly for a spring tour, and Levin, Volk, and Smith flew to New York because they had a gig on the Ed Sullivan Show planned. And the story goes is that Revere was upset about Jim Valli and Volk and Smith getting ready to leave, and he kind of blamed Drake Levin. All right. Now, Levin showed up to play, and Revere said, "No, you're not playing." And this is like, right before the Ed Sullivan Show. The first and only time they were ever on it. And he refused them to play. You're not playing tonight. I got this new guy named Freddie Weller, and Levin handled it well. He held no grudges about it, and he actually gave Weller some points on playing chords and stuff like that. And he actually watched it from the side of the stage. Okay. And that was their only appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, April 30th, 1967. The following month, Volk and Smith would leave, okay, and they teamed up with Levin and actually started a band called Brotherhood. Now, you got to wonder, was Revere right in being upset? Because it seems like he snatched them up, right, to start his own band. That's what it seems like. But there might be more to it. Now, there was a bass player they knew named Charlie Coe. He was brought into play. And then a drummer named Joe Carrero was brought in to do the drumming. The changing music in 68 kind of found their popularity waning. They were like a little bit out of fashion now. 68, music was getting psychedelic. The Beatles had already put out Sgt. Pepper. Now we're into 68, the White Album. So many things were changing. Paul Revere and the Raiders were looking a little old hat, So they still had some hits. There was some singles, Ups and Downs, I Had a Dream, Too Much Talk, Don't Take It So Hard, a song called Cinderella Sunshine, Mr. Sun and Mr. Moon, and Let Me.
These were all like, this would go album also.
Yeah, that would be a gold album, the one with Let Me on it. In January of 68, Revere and Lindsay returned to TV on a new Dick Clark show called Happening 68. Later, it would just be shortened to Happening. But Coe would leave the band in August of that year to go get married, and former Where the Action Is heartthrob, a guy named Keith Allison, was brought in on bass. Now, he was a guy that was on Where the Action Is as one of these like teen idol type things. So he was brought in to play bass. All right. Mark Lindsay kind of at this point was gaining control of the band. He started producing a lot of the records for them. There was a single called Too Much Talk that they put out in 68. A new album called Something Happening. It was kind of a psychedelic album. Definitely had like a lot of psychedelic elements to it. An album called Hard and Heavy with Marshmallows. There was another one called Alias Pink Puzz.
What name for an album?
Yeah. Now, it's very interesting because the band was waning in popularity. That people weren't listening to them as much anymore. They weren't selling as much. And when they came out with the Pink Puzz album, they tried like a little trick. They tried to release the band. I'm sorry, release the album under the name Pink Puzz. Okay, like they weren't
Yeah.
Paul Revere. Like, let's use a different name and see what happens. But it didn't work. Everybody knew
It was a
them,
failure.
and whatever. It did not work. But they did a lot of touring in the summer of '69. They ended up going to Europe with the
That
Beach
sounds
Boys.
weird. Like Paul Revere and the Beach Boys, I think that's a weird lineup. Just
No, you know what? They actually, I think it's on is it the Just Like Us album or Midnight Ride? I forget. It's one of the two. There's a song that's a typical Beach Boys sounding song called SS 369.
okay.
Back
Yeah.
Park. And when you hear it, it sounds like a fucking Beach Boys song, like Little GTO or something, you know. But what they
Yeah,
would
that
do
thing
is
didn't
when
that
they were in
song wind
Europe,
up in a commercial or something?
it might have. They did do a couple of commercials with their songs at that time. Now, when they were on tour with the Beach Boys, they recorded 2 songs for the German music show Beat Club. Okay. Paul Revere and the Raiders would then, by 1970, they did decide to do an official name change, and they just went down to the Raiders.
Yep.
Okay. They weren't Paul Revere and the Raiders, just the Raiders. They would come out with an album called Collage. And I actually like this album. I listened to it today. I hadn't heard it in like quite a few years. It's a heavy. I don't know. There's something about it I like. It's a heavier album. It's not as garagey sounding. It's almost like, it's a couple of songs on there you think would be almost like Leslie West's Fountain. Something like heavier stuff like that. That might not be the best example, but I'm thinking it's just a heavier sound than they ever
But
had.
that song was like also another commercial failure, right? For some reason, that album.
It only got to 154
Wow.
in the top 200. But there was a song on there you should check out called "The Boys in the Band." I think it's the first song on the album. Very cool tune. Lindsey, because of the Collage not doing well, Lindsey was becoming like more interested in doing solo stuff. All right. Now, Joe Carrero would leave the band, and he would be replaced by returning drummer Mike
It's
Smith.
amazing how that group, they had so many band players, but they had a lot of people that would go and then come back.
Well, I think, to me, playing in that band, it had to have a lot of pluses to it, because you had, I don't know, it just seems like only certain people could play in that band, so they had a lot of returning members, like you say. They probably always had gigs lined up. Okay, because even when they weren't selling, they were touring, and I think as a musician, especially in those days, you wanted to tour, so they were constantly doing that. In '71, Mark Lindsey was working on a solo recording, and I think he got approached by, I guess, Paul Revere and a couple other people, and they decided to do a recording of John D. Loudermilk's Indian Reservation.
And what a hit that was. Holy shit.
That was a huge hit. Okay, now they released it. Paul Revere went out himself and promoted this song heavily. Okay, as a new song, it was a song about Cherokee people.
But
Cherokee
let me
Nation.
ask you, Mark Lindsey
knows
originally was going to do that as a solo album, right? As a solo recording?
I think what happened, I don't know if it was going to be a solo for him or the band approached him while he was doing some solo recording. Okay. So it was kind of like around the same time. It was always a Paul Revere and the Raiders song. It was never Mark Lindsey. But it actually went to #1 for 1 week in July of '71.
That's huge.
And it was Columbia's biggest selling single of the 1970s. Wow. It sold 6 million copies.
For almost a decade, it was #1.
Think about that. How many songs in the 70s and how many artists they must have had on Columbia, and that that was their biggest single of the 70s.
Dude, but that song is such a catchy song. When the beat,
I'll be honest with you, man. I hate that song.
Well, are you an Indian fucking racist, man?
Nah, I think it's Native American. Okay, It's not. You know what? Hate is a strong word. I don't hate it. I just I get mad because when I hear it, and then I think about the other 25,000 songs they have before that
Oh
that are
yeah, of
better.
course.
And it's like what it's like what happened to some of these other songs? That this one had to be
But
the
you know
big
what the
hit,
problem
but
was
it was
when that song came out? It was a definitely. It was like almost like a kind of catchy dance, kind of disco, kind of
it
weird.
was
It
a
was a good.
comeback
It was
song.
a great comeback
Come
song. Yeah.
it was a comeback song for them, and they deserved it. It's a good song. It's a I always kind of in my mind, when I think of 70s one hit wonders, I always
Yeah.
think of that, but it wasn't
Nah.
really a one hit wonder because Paul Revere and the Raiders. But it's just kind of in the 70s, they didn't really make much of a splash, and that was their really only
It's
big
almost
hit.
like I like to shit on Cheap Tricks every so often. I like to give him a little cheap shot.
Yeah. Now, riding on the single, they would come out with an album of the same name, Indian Reservation, and it actually got to number 19, even though most of the album was covers. Okay, it still
But
did
they
pretty
always
well.
did pretty good with covers, Like they were one of the few bands that you would
Oh
love
yeah,
to see them cover a song because you're like,
they
wow.
would. No, yeah, they do a great version of the Stones'
Yeah.
Satisfaction. Oh man, so many songs. That song New Orleans is good. A lot. There's like 3 or 4 covers on the Just Like Us album that are fantastic. In '72, the Raiders released an album called Country Wine that bombed, and then they prepared a new album called Love Music, which also bombed. So at this point, Columbia kind of shelved them, all right, and wasn't putting out any material. But the band started. They continued touring. They played state fairs. They played lounge clubs, and they kind of were booked almost as an oldies act, which Paul Revere himself didn't really mind it. Okay, but Mark Lindsay was like, "Nah, this ain't happening." They were playing in front of 100
But you know
people.
what, Paul? I can see Paul being like that. Cause think about it, they started doing like teen shows, teen dance. I guess they're going back to the roots almost.
And Paul Revere was about 4 or 5 years older
Yeah.
than Mark Lindsay, so he might have been in a mindset like, "I want to slow down a little bit." So maybe doing state fairs and stuff like that. It might have been easier than actually going out on a tour bus and doing gig after gig after gig. But Mark Lindsay wouldn't like it. By '75 now, this went on for a
Yeah, he
couple
was
of
out.
years. Yeah, he would leave the band, and it was after a gig at an amusement park. Okay, they played a gig at Knott's Berry Farms in Buena Park, California. It's an amusement park. All right, he would go on to do some film scoring, commercials, and he also became the head of A&R, Artist and Repertoire, at the United Artists Records in the late '70s. So he was signing bands for
But you
United
can tell
Artists.
he always wanted to kind of do that because he started producing, doing stuff
Yeah,
like that. So you can see the
yeah.
guys like, you know what, I want to do something different.
He was getting more into the behind the scenes
Yeah.
kind of stuff. Now Paul Revere would continue on with the Raiders through the '70s. In July 4th, on the bicentennial of 1976, he got married on stage
Wow.
at a live show. Okay. Now he would also contemplate retiring that year, but it wouldn't last, and he would get a new version of the Raiders together at the end of '76. Now they would continue touring. By the late '70s and early '80s, there were punk rock and new wave bands that were acknowledging the Raiders, and they would cover songs by them, like the Sex Pistols, Minor Threat, Circle Jerks, Joan
Wow.
Jett. Okay, they all covered Raiders songs. Sex Pistols did a great cover of "I'm Not Your
Oh yeah, I
Stepsister."
remember that.
Okay, yeah. Now that was always one of my favorites. The Monkees is actually the more popular
Yeah, I
version in
love that
America,
monkey version.
but yeah, they're both good. But the Raiders one is really good. That's
Hey,
the
so
original.
Mike, can you tell me about this quick reunion they had on the Dick Clark show?
Yeah, I think it was like a 20th anniversary or 25th anniversary of them.
Okay.
Okay, in the late '70s, and yeah, I think it was like '78, so it might have been like their 20th anniversary together. And Dick Clark had like a reunion of '60s bands, and they got back together briefly. they did, I think, 2 songs on that
Okay,
TV show.
good.
All right. Yeah, it was very cool. But again, they were kind of an oldies act at that point. All right. Um, what was happening in the late 70s, also in early 80s, by the early 80s pretty much, is there was this revival of kind of like 60s garage music. You had bands like the Fuzz Tones, you had bands like the Chesterfield Kings. They would all cover Paul Revere songs. The Chesterfield Kings would actually release a single, I believe, in the early 90s with Mark Lindsay singing. They would do a cover of Where the Action Is, okay, which is great. I actually have that single. Through the 80s and 90s, they toured consistently, but they were kind of on the oldies circuit. By September of 1997, Mark Lindsay, guitarist Drake Levin, bassist Phil Volk, and Smitty Smith on drums reunited without Paul Revere to do a 30-year reunion gig in Portland. Okay, that was a big deal. But Paul Revere himself was not part of it, and I couldn't find a reason why. I have no idea why he wasn't. By 2000, there was a company called Sundazed Records, which had been around for a couple of years. They're a very cool label, Sundazed Records. They re-release a lot of older stuff and put it out, kind of like Rhino.
Yeah.
Like they put it out with like all the original artwork and stuff like that. But they were also putting out compilations, and they made a 2 CD retrospective called Mojo Workout. Right, and it sold very well, which was basically dealing with their early stuff. It didn't get into like Indian Reservation and all that. In 2001, they would release a new album, and it was some new songs, and it was a re-recording of older tracks. It was called Ride the Wall, and all the proceeds went to Vietnam War veteran charities. Around that time, they would also start playing gigs called the Rolling Thunder Memorial Day Show in Washington that they do every year. That's for like POWs and MIAs. Yeah. And again, though, they were different singers. Mark Lindsay was not part of this, but Paul Revere himself would be out there with different lineups every time, and it was popular enough to keep going, and that's what he enjoyed. By October 4th, 2014, though, there was bad news, and he had passed away from cancer.
Yep,
Paul Revere. He passed away at his Garden Valley, Idaho home. By the next few days, there was a gig in the LA Forum. Tom Petty was playing, and he did a little tribute to him. He actually played.
I actually seen that. Like, I seen.
Yeah,
I seen like him singing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, is that a clip?
I think you can see on YouTube. You can see, but I have heard that version of Tom Petty. I'm not your stepping stone. It's pretty fucking good.
Wow. And Paul Revere's music is still heard today. Like we mentioned earlier in the Quentin Tarantino movie last year.
Yeah, there was like 3 songs there, man.
They used "Good Thing," which is a great song. "Hungry" and "Mr. Sun and Mr.
Great.
Moon." Yeah. So the one band also that was very influenced by Paul Revere and the Raiders was the Cramps.
I can see that. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. "Kicks" and "Hungry" were songs that they would do live early on in their career. That's all I got for you today, Mr. Roscoe.
Dude, let me tell you, that's a lot of history. A lot of that band was huge, man. Like back in the days. And you know what? It's still got like a weird form of the band to today.
Yeah. Without Paul Revere,
it's not the original. It's like totally different people, but they still carrying the the Raiders kind of tunes and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, look, anybody listening to 60s music that owes something to that band, they were just catchy pop songs with great guitar sound. It was kind of heavy in some ways. I just think they're a great band that kind of gets overlooked. They're not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I don't give 2 fucks, but somebody should nominate them. I don't know if they've ever been nominated and shot down, but somebody should nominate them. They sold them.
Yeah, they definitely. So, and I think they should be one of the bands that definitely go into that Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, man. They deserve to be in there.
I think so. So, what else we got coming up?
I think June we got a
we
bunch
got
of shit
June
coming in
up.
June. This is the last episode in May, and then in June we have a fucking hell of a lineup for everybody. Listen to the Rock Show. We got the making of Appetite for Destruction, Guns N' Roses. We might have a guest for that. We have Mel Hagler also. A little
country music we're bringing in Mel Haggard.
You know, we also got Gigi Allen, the White Stripe, and
we're gonna have
the Shit the Bucket Cheap Tricks. Yeah.
Yeah, shit the bucket. Speaking of shit, there might be some shit at the Gigi Allen show we do. You never know. Hopefully we're back in video.
Yeah, hopefully, but right now we're still doing our thing, where everybody's doing it. Me and John been doing a show a week ever since this thing happened. So the Freak Show, the Rock Show,
right,
and the Conspiracy Show. We got a special Conspiracy Show coming this week. We're gonna talk about a lot of shit, and it's gonna be from the 5G to many different of the conspiracy things that are going on. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, we're going to be talking about it a lot. We're going to get back on that conspiracy.
So, Mike, thank you for everything, and remember, don't get drunk, get lumped up.
Get drunk.
See you next week.
Lumped up.